It was the kind of day Judge Ellen Monroe had lived through 100 times before. Picture the scene. The courthouse steps behind her, case files tucked under her arm, the late afternoon sun warming her face. She was seen walking to her car. Just like always, but this time she never made it home. For 15 years her family searched, clinging to hope. And for 15 years there was nothing. Not a trace, not a clue until a worker, restoring a crumbling back wall of the courthouse, uncovered something that would deliver the shock of a lifetime to her family. The summer of 1985 in Milstone, Virginia, was like any other, humid days. Hung heavy, the soft buzzing of cicadas filled the air, and courthouse business ticked along quietly. Milstone wasn't the kind of place where judges vanished. It was a small town where everyone knew everyone, where every face was familiar. That's what made Ellen Monroe's disappearance so unbearable. At 38, Ellen had already made history as one of the youngest female judges in the state. Appointed to the bench just 3 years earlier, she carried a grace and authority that made her both respected and quietly envied. In her trademark white glasses and neatly pressed black robe, she had become almost iconic on Milstone's courthouse steps. Her sister, Margaret, still remembered that day vividly. She had brought Ellen lunch like she always did on Thursdays, and the two had sat under the big oak tree by the courthouse lawn. Ellen had been distracted that day, Margaret recalled. "There's something off about this new case," Ellen had said, pushing the turkey sandwich aside. "It's not the facts, it's the people involved." Too many whispers. Margaret didn't ask for details. She knew better than to probe into Ellen's cases. Judicial confidentiality wasn't something Ellen took lightly. That was the last real conversation they had. Later that afternoon, around 4:15 p.m., Ellen was seen walking down the courthouse steps, carrying her brown leather purse and court files, waving briefly to Deputy Hall as he pulled his patrol car into the parking lot. By 4:30, she was supposed to meet Margaret for coffee. She never arrived. When the police were called at 6 p.m., it was already growing dark. Her car remained in its usual reserved spot at the courthouse lot. The keys were not inside. Her purse, glasses, and files were missing. And there were no signs of struggle, no witnesses, no security cameras in 1985. No tire tracks, no ransom note. Sheriff Bill Haynes led the initial investigation. He had worked in Milstone for 30 years and had never seen anything like it. "It's like she just evaporated," he told the press. 2 days later, rumors flooded the town. Some whispered she had run off. Others speculated she was threatened over a case. A few even suggested more sinister theories: abduction, corruption, or revenge. But none of it was backed by any evidence. Margaret refused to believe any of it. She wouldn't have left, Margaret insisted, her voice shaking during her interview with local reporters. "Not without calling. Not without telling me." Ellen's husband, Richard Monroe, struggled to hold his composure in front of the cameras. "I just want her home," he kept repeating. The weeks dragged into months. Search parties combed the nearby woods, rivers, and abandoned buildings. FBI agents briefly joined the investigation, but without leads, they eventually withdrew. The town grew quieter again, as though it was easier for people to forget. But not Margaret and not Richard. Every year on the anniversary of Ellen's disappearance, Margaret organized a small vigil on the courthouse lawn. She'd place a single white rose on the courthouse steps beneath the marble columns where Ellen had once proudly stood. 15 years passed, and then, in 2000, the county approved long-overdue renovations to the aging courthouse building. Erosion behind the courthouse had begun to weaken parts of the foundation. A crew was brought in to stabilize the crumbling rear wall, a section few people ever visited. It was there, behind decades-old bricks and layers of dust, that one worker's shovel struck something unexpected, something metal, and beneath that, layers of decayed fabric and glass. The sight Supervisor immediately halted the work and called the sheriff's office. When the evidence was carefully pulled from behind the collapsed section of wall, the items were unmistakable: a pair of broken white glasses, a decayed leather purse, and a heavily corroded gold watch, frozen at exactly 4:27 p.m. The sheriff's office notified Margaret and Richard that night. Margaret collapsed when she heard. For 15 years, these items, her sister's glasses, her purse, her watch, had been lying just feet from where she was last seen, concealed behind the very courthouse where they had searched so desperately. The discovery reignited the case. With a fury, the media returned. Old rumors resurfaced, but so did long-forgotten details. Sheriff Haynes, now retired, came forward with a box of unsolved case files from 1985. There was more, he admitted. Quietly, things we couldn't prove back then. Among the files were witness statements that had long been disregarded. A courthouse janitor who reported hearing muffled arguing near the back offices that afternoon. A court clerk who remembered seeing an unfamiliar maintenance worker near the restricted archives room just before Ellen vanished. A delivery man who swore he saw Ellen speaking with someone in a dark sedan hours before she disappeared. Details dismissed as unreliable at the time, but none of these leads had ever tied together. No fingerprints, no forensic evidence, no confirmed suspect. Now, with these personal items found behind the courthouse, everything had to be reevaluated. Margaret sat at her kitchen table that night, staring at the returned glasses, purse, and corroded watch laid carefully before her. She ran her fingers over the cracked leather strap of the watch, the one Ellen had worn every day for years. "Someone knew exactly where to hide you," she whispered. The next morning, the courthouse was surrounded by yellow tape. Crews from the sheriff's department worked carefully around the exposed brick cavity behind the courthouse wall. Every piece of loose mortar was bagged, every fragment photographed. Deputy Carla Simmons, now leading the revived investigation, stood silently, arms folded. She had grown up in Milstone, barely 15 when Judge Monroe vanished. She still remembered her mother whispering about it for years. Carla examined the small collection of recovered items laid out on a folding table under a canopy: the watch, purse, the white glasses. They were badly aged but unmistakable. And yet one thing disturbed her. "No remains," she said softly. "Nothing else." Sheriff Holbrook, standing beside her, nodded grimly. 15 years, but no body. Just these. "Someone placed these here," Carla said afterward. "Or maybe from the start." They both knew what that implied. This wasn't accidental. Whoever had done this had used the courthouse itself, likely someone who knew its quiet back corridors and the lesser-used service routes built decades earlier. The forensic team carefully mapped the cavity. It wasn't a natural collapse. The bricks had been removed manually at some point, the opening skillfully concealed, an intentional hiding place. Carla requested the original 1985 courthouse blueprints from the county archives. Within a day, the dusty architectural plans arrived. As they rolled open the large sheets across the evidence room table, one oddity became immediately clear. A small service tunnel ran directly behind the cavity where the items were found. "What was this used for?" Carla asked. "Old coal chute," Holbrook answered. "They converted it after the courthouse switched to electric heating in the late 60s, but it still exists." "Who had access to it?" Holbrook exhaled slowly. "Maintenance, janitorial staff, possibly some courthouse employees who knew about the old designs." Margaret was called back in to review the findings. Sitting quietly in the sheriff's office, she stared at the blueprints. "Ellen mentioned strange things, you know," she said after a pause. "A few weeks before she disappeared." "Like what?" Carla asked. She didn't give details, but she said she was uncomfortable with certain people trying to access sealed case files. She was being asked to sign off on document removals she didn't recognize. "Who was asking?" Carla pressed gently. Margaret shook her head. She never said, but she was uneasy. And Ellen wasn't easily rattled. Carla made a note. Internal document access, potentially tied to someone inside the courthouse. It narrowed things down. Over the next several days, Carla and her team quietly pulled old courthouse employee records. Names of maintenance workers, clerks, assistants, and law clerks who worked in 1985 were cross-checked with any unusual activity during that year. One name surfaced repeatedly: Joseph Fallon. In 1985, Fallon had worked as a junior court records clerk, a position that gave him partial access to archived case files. He resigned suddenly 6 months after Ellen's disappearance and left Milstone. Entirely. There had been nothing suspicious noted at the time, but buried in the old employment file was a brief HR complaint: failure to follow proper authorization, procedures for restricted records. Carla looked closer. She ordered Fallon's personnel file pulled in full. What she found made her stomach turn. 2 months prior to Ellen's disappearance, Fallon had attempted to retrieve sealed financial case records connected to private estate disputes files that required judicial approval. Judge Monroe had denied several of his access requests. At the time, it appeared routine, but now it no longer felt routine. Carla cross-referenced the financial cases Fallon had tried to access. Many were property dispute cases involving old landholdings that had changed ownership during the courthouse renovations of the early 70s. A pattern began to emerge. Margaret was called back in. Did Ellen ever mention the name Joseph Fallon? Carla asked. Margaret thought for a long moment. No, but she once mentioned strange pressure from people tied to some old property cases. Did she say who? No. Did she ever feel threatened? Margaret hesitated. She wasn't the kind to admit fear. But yes, I think she was worried. Carla sat quietly for a moment before adding, "We've located Joseph Fallon. He's alive, living under a different name now in Oregon." Margaret's breath caught. "You think he—" Carla shook her head. "We don't know yet." An interview request was sent through federal agents. Fallon agreed to speak voluntarily. The interview was recorded. "I don't know anything about Judge Monroe's disappearance," Fallon insisted, his voice even flat. "Yes, I worked there. Yes, I requested records. It was part of my job." "Why did you leave so suddenly?" the agent asked. "I got another job offer." The agent paused. "You know, we recovered her personal belongings inside the courthouse walls, right behind the service tunnel you would have passed daily." Fallon shifted slightly in his seat. "I didn't know that. Can you explain why your access card was used to enter that service tunnel 2 days before she vanished?" That's when Fallon's expression changed for the first time. He leaned back. His voice cracked slightly. "I was told to retrieve old files, that's all. I didn't know anything else." "Told by who?" Fallon shook his head. "I'm not saying another word without my attorney." The interview ended. Back in Milstone, Margaret sat quietly listening to the recorded interview. It was the first real movement the case had seen in years. But still, there was no direct evidence, no confession, no body, and worst of all, no clear answer to what exactly happened to Ellen that afternoon. For now, all they had were fragments, old files, hidden tunnels, and 15 years of silence. But something in Margaret's gut told her they were finally getting close. Margaret sat at her kitchen table long after the recording had stopped playing. The silence of her small home was familiar by now, but on this night, it pressed on her differently. The discovery of Ellen's belongings behind the courthouse had already been painful enough. But now, with Joseph Fallon's interview lingering in her ears, it was something else entirely. It wasn't just grief anymore, it was doubt. Questions circled her mind like old ghosts that never rested. Had Fallon been directly involved? Was he protecting someone? Or had someone else used him as a pawn? One thing was certain. Ellen's disappearance wasn't random. Back at the sheriff's office, Deputy Carla Simmons and Sheriff Holbrook met into the night. They reviewed every angle they had uncovered so far. "It's still circumstantial," Holbrook said quietly, staring at Fallon's transcript. "I know," Carla admitted, rubbing her forehead. "But he's lying, or at least withholding something." Holbrook stood and walked to the whiteboard they had filled over the past weeks. They had mapped out everyone connected to Ellen's last few months on the bench. Old cases, land disputes, estate transfers, criminal trials. Dozens of names formed a web that felt wide and disconnected at first. But then Carla circled one thread again, the property disputes. It was a long-standing inheritance battle between two wealthy Milstone families, the Caulfields and the Whitakers. Dozens of acres of old farmland near the courthouse had shifted ownership during the courthouse expansions in the 1970s. The more Carla dug into the history, the stranger it became. The original land deeds from those cases were, according to the court logs, misfiled or marked as missing sometime between 1984 and 1985, coincidentally, just before Ellen vanished. Carla leaned forward. "We need to look at these property disputes closer." Holbrook nodded slowly. "We may have been chasing the wrong part of the timeline." Margaret was brought back again for another meeting. "We believe Ellen may have been caught between two private parties fighting over land assets," Carla explained carefully. "She was overseeing some of these filings personally." Margaret exhaled. "She said something similar that summer, but I didn't understand it at the time." "What exactly?" Margaret closed her eyes, trying to recall Ellen's words. "She said, they think I'm just a rubber stamp, but they don't understand that some things can't be undone just because money changes hands." She was angry. Carla made a note. "Did she say who they were?" "No, she was careful," Holbrook interrupted gently. "Was she ever threatened, even indirectly?" Margaret nodded reluctantly. "She started locking her office door during breaks. She carried pepper spray. She even asked me once if I thought I was paranoid to have someone walk her to her car in the evenings." Carla's mind raced. If Ellen felt she was being watched or pressured, why hadn't she filed a formal complaint? Why not document it? Why hadn't anyone else come forward? The problem, Carla knew, was simple. Judges in small towns like Milstone operated in tight circles. Political favors, personal friendships, and small-town secrets were deeply intertwined. Sometimes formal complaints didn't go anywhere. Sometimes they were never written at all. 2 days later, the breakthrough came unexpectedly. A retired court stenographer named Linda Parker reached out. "I've been carrying this for too long," Linda confessed when she arrived at the sheriff's office. She was in her 70s now, frail but sharp. "I typed everything back then. I saw more than most people realize." Linda unfolded an old notepad. "I kept some private notes during Ellen's final month. Not official transcripts, just personal observations." Carla carefully opened the fragile notebook. Inside were dates, case names, and short scribbled comments. One entry stood out: July 14, 1985. Caulfield versus Whitaker. Hearing delayed again. Heated argument outside Judge Monroe's chambers afterward. Man in dark gray suit waiting by exit. Ellen looked shaken. Carla looked up sharply. "Did you recognize the man?" Linda shook her head. "No name, but I know he wasn't local. Did Ellen ever mention him?" "No, but I remember how pale she looked that afternoon." Carla scanned the entry again. Dark gray suit. Out-of-towner connected to property dispute. No name on record. The web tightened further. That man, whoever he was, could be the missing piece. But after 15 years, finding his name was like chasing smoke. Carla shifted focus. The Caulfields and Whitakers both had extensive business interests across multiple states. Several of their companies were involved in land development, resource mining, and most interestingly, private courthouse maintenance contracts. Hidden inside the contract files was an old maintenance company called Eastbrook Facilities. Hired briefly in early 1985 for structural evaluations of the Milstone Courthouse. A shell company, Eastbrook, was dissolved only a year later. The listed manager, a man named Peter Lamb. Peter Lamb didn't appear in any prior investigation files. His name had never been mentioned before. And yet, Eastbrook had operated directly inside the courthouse in the months leading up to Ellen's disappearance, when the back wall cavity may have been accessed or altered. Carla stared at the name, feeling her pulse quicken. Who was Peter Lamb? Record searches revealed only fragments. Lamb was linked to 2 additional shell companies involved in property development. He had no permanent residence listed after 1987, multiple known aliases, limited employment history, and no clear family ties. When Carla shared the findings with Margaret, the color drained from her face. "I've heard that name," Margaret whispered. "Where?" Ellen mentioned it once, but not like that. She called him Mr. Lamb, said he was the man who kept showing up behind closed doors. Carla leaned forward. Did she say why? Margaret's voice trembled. She said he was always there when certain property cases were discussed. She thought he was a consultant or a lawyer hired by one of the families. But the way she said it, it scared me. Carla's breath slowed. Peter Lamb wasn't some random maintenance contractor. He was present during private meetings. He had access to restricted files. And now his company name was linked directly to the physical structure of the courthouse, the very spot where Ellen's belongings were buried. But still, no direct proof. No motive, no confession, only a growing shadow behind Milstone's seemingly peaceful facade. And yet, something inside Carla told her they were standing at the edge of the truth. They just hadn't touched it yet. The more they dug, the more it felt like they were walking through an old house where someone had carefully locked every door before leaving. Every piece of information pointed toward something deliberate, calculated, and buried beneath years of silence. But the people involved had made sure no fingerprints remained. Carla Simmons knew that if they were going to open any of these locked doors, it had to happen soon. Peter Lamb had simply vanished after 1987. The trail went cold after a small financial firm he managed in Maryland dissolved suddenly and left no forwarding addresses. The deeper they checked, the more aliases emerged. Peter Lang, Paul Loop, even a fake consultant ID under the name Patrick Lane. Whoever Lamb was, he was a professional at staying hidden. Sheriff Holbrook stepped into Carla's office one morning with another file in hand. "You'll want to see this." It was a background check they'd run on Eastbrook Facilities' corporate filings. The original registration had been filed through a law firm based in Washington, D.C., the attorney of record, Gerald McKinnon. McKinnon was a corporate lawyer specializing in real estate law. But what caught Carla's attention was his list of clients, several with connections to both the Caulfield and Whitaker families. For the first time, the families who had stayed quietly in the background were now sitting closer to the center of the board. Margaret sat in the corner of Carla's office, quietly listening. If Ellen knew who these men really worked for, Margaret said softly, she would have refused to cooperate. She believed in the law. Carla nodded. And if she stood in the way of powerful people's money, that may have been enough. For the first time since Ellen's belongings were recovered, Carla requested formal interviews with surviving members of the Caulfield and Whitaker families. Both families politely declined. "There's too much old history," one of the attorneys said over the phone. "Neither family wishes to reopen painful chapters that have long been closed." Painful for who? Carla thought bitterly. With formal channels drying up, Carla decided to pull old courthouse visitor logs from 1985 dusty, handwritten ledgers archived in storage. It was tedious work, but after several hours of cross-referencing dates, she found something. On multiple occasions during June and July 1985, a visitor named Peter Lamb signed in under Property Appraisal Review. Each time, He met with a junior clerk inside the courthouse, sometimes staying for hours. The clerk's name, Joseph Fallon. There it was direct contact between Fallon and Lom multiple times leading up to Ellen's disappearance. Carla closed the book slowly. It was becoming more and more obvious. Fallon hadn't just been a low-level clerk requesting records. He had been working with Lom, and likely with others behind Lom, but Fallon was now protected by legal counsel. Every attempt to press him further hit a wall. "Without hard proof, we can't move him," Sheriff Holbrook reminded her. "And we don't have a body." Carla hated that sentence. It was true, but it felt cruel. Margaret stayed late at the station almost every night, reviewing old files alongside Carla. One evening, while scanning Ellen's old case summaries, Margaret stopped suddenly. "This one," she whispered. This case, she was deeply worried about this one. It was a probate dispute involving farmland held by the Whitaker family for decades. In 1985, a distant cousin contested the ownership, claiming forgery on earlier transfer documents. The dispute had quietly disappeared from court records after Ellen vanished. The entire case file was labeled "settled out of court." But strangely, no settlement documents existed in the official archives. Carla examined the records carefully. Which family member contested it? Margaret read the name, Alan Whitaker Jr. Carla searched for him in public records. Alan Jr. had moved out of state in 1986. No charges were ever filed against him. He died suddenly in 1995, an apparent suicide. His assets, including disputed parcels of land, reverted back to the core Whitaker family after his death. It was becoming clear that Ellen Monroe's disappearance wasn't random. It was business. Carla finally made a decision. "We're bringing in Gerald McKinnon," she told Holbrook, the attorney who handled Eastbrook's filings. McKinnon was still alive, still practicing quietly in D.C. with federal cooperation. Carla and Holbrook traveled to interview him under formal subpoena. McKinnon appeared relaxed when they met. "I have very little to offer you," he said calmly. "Those filings were processed legally." "Were you aware of Peter Lom's multiple aliases?" Carla asked directly. "That's not unusual for contract consultants," McKinnon shrugged. "Shell companies are common for tax purposes." "Do you recall why Eastbrook Facilities was hired to inspect Milstone Courthouse in 1985? Holbrook pressed. McKinnon smiled faintly. "Because the county hired them." Carla leaned forward. "But the contract wasn't issued through the county." McKinnon paused for a fraction of a second. "Just enough. It was arranged privately through a maintenance fund provided by the Caulfield Whitaker Joint Historical Restoration Trust." There it was. Carla saw it on his face, the split-second hesitation before answering. The renovations were never purely county business. Private hands controlled the project, and private hands paid for private access. Still, McKinnon remained careful. "I'm an attorney, not an investigator," he said smoothly. "My clients are confidential." The meeting ended with little else on record, but it was enough. The funding, the shell companies, the silent families, they had all created a closed system where access, control, and secrecy could thrive. And in the middle of it stood Ellen Monroe, a young judge who simply refused to bend. That night, Margaret sat alone at home, flipping slowly through a dusty photo album of her sister's career, the courthouse steps, the awards, the news clippings celebrating Ellen's appointment. She stopped at one picture. It was taken just weeks before Ellen vanished. Standing beside her, shaking her hand at a fundraiser event, was a man Margaret had never paid attention to before. Peter Lom. She had seen him before, standing right there, smiling politely for the cameras. And now she knew he hadn't just been watching Ellen from a distance. He had been right next to her all along. The photograph sat on Carla's desk under a small reading lamp. She studied it for a long time. Peter Lamb's face was clear, clean-shaven, late 40s, sharp features. standing next to Ellen at the courthouse fundraiser. No disguise, no attempt to hide. He was simply there, part of the room, like countless donors, attorneys, and community members attending that evening. Carla quietly circled his face with a pencil. He hadn't just been working in the shadows. He had been openly involved in Milstone's legal and political circles months before Ellen vanished. That changed everything. The story wasn't about secret tunnels and midnight break-ins anymore. It was about people who had inserted themselves directly into Ellen's world. Sheriff Holbrook stepped in, carrying a file. "You need to see this." Inside was an old background check, never fully processed in 1985. It came from federal financial records, Holbrook explained. Lounge shell companies weren't only registered for property services. They were involved in private mediation for disputed estate transfers. Carla frowned. Meaning what? Meaning he wasn't just helping maintain the courthouse structure. He was managing behind-the-scenes negotiations, quiet deals between families who wanted things handled outside the formal court system. Carla exhaled slowly. So when Ellen refused to sign off on certain filings, she wasn't just blocking paperwork. She was interfering with private interests. Holbrook nodded. Interests with a lot of money tied to them. Margaret sat silently as they reviewed the findings together. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages. She always said the paperwork didn't feel right, Margaret whispered, like people were trying to skip steps. She thought it was sloppiness. Maybe it wasn't, Carla replied. They continued building the timeline. By early July 1985, Ellen had denied at least 2 separate requests to certify changes to land titles. The requests would have transferred disputed farmland from outside family claimants back into the hands of the Caulfield-Whitaker joint partnership. Both times, the filings were returned unsigned, with legal notations attached by Ellen herself. Weeks later, she vanished. Carla wasn't ready to call that coincidence, but even with this mounting evidence, there was still no direct proof of a crime. No confession, no witnesses, and most painfully for Margaret, still no body. The team quietly widened their investigation. One question kept circling in Carla's mind. How was Ellen moved? Her personal belongings had been recovered behind a sealed section of courthouse wall. But if Ellen was taken from the property, dead or alive, it would have required both access and time. The courthouse wasn't large, but it had multiple service corridors and rarely used exits. That's when Carla remembered an old interview buried deep in the original files. A former janitor named Walter Beacom. He'd worked evenings in 1985, cleaning offices after hours. At the time, Walter had reported hearing voices in one of the back stairwells on the evening Ellen vanished, but his statement was dismissed as unreliable. He had been drinking that night, and deputies hadn't taken his account seriously. Walter was now in his late 70s, retired, living quietly in assisted care. Carla drove out to meet him personally. Sitting in the small common room, Walter squinted as she showed him the photograph of Peter Lamb. "Do you recognize him, Mr. Beacom?" Carla asked softly. Walter leaned forward, studying the picture for several seconds. "Yeah," he said finally. "I seen him. When?" "A few times that summer." Walter paused. "He was in the basement sometimes." "Not supposed to be there." "In the courthouse basement?" Walter nodded. "Had keys." "Always came." "In late afternoon, sometimes with one of them clerks." "Which clerk?" "The skinny kid with the glasses." "Fallon, I think." Carla's chest tightened slightly. "Do you remember seeing either of them the day Judge Monroe went missing?" Walter thought for a long moment. "I remember seeing the clerk that night near the back lot, loading something in a car. I couldn't." "See what?" "It was dark and I didn't want trouble, so I kept walking." "Did you see Judge Monroe?" Walter shook his head. "No, ma'am." "Only the clerk. Why didn't you tell anyone this before?" Walter looked away, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because back then, you didn't cross certain people. In this town. Carla sat quietly, letting the silence fill the space. Walter had no reason to lie now. And while his memory might have faded on smaller details, his account added another thread to an already tangled web. Fallon and Lom had been seen together after hours, moving something heavy near the back lot, the very area where the hidden cavity in the courthouse wall was located. Carla returned to her office, pulling blueprints again. She traced the surface. Tunnel route. The access door to that tunnel exited just a few yards from where Walter described seeing Fallon that night. It was possible, even likely, that Ellen's personal belongings had been moved through that tunnel. But had Ellen herself been there too? And if so, alive or already dead? Carla's stomach twisted at the thought. Margaret visited the station. The following morning. Carla laid it out for her as gently as she could. We believe your sister may have been lured or forced into the service areas behind the courthouse. Fallon and Lom had access. They could have moved her belongings quickly and sealed them inside the wall cavity. Margaret's eyes filled but didn't break. But where is she? She asked in a hollow voice. 15 years and still nothing. Carla had no answer. Without a body, it was all still conjecture. Legally speaking, Ellen was still classified as a missing person. The next step was to finally confront Fallon again. With new federal pressure and witness statements from both Walter and the recently recovered files, Fallon was brought back for her. Questioning. This time, his tone was different. I told you before, Fallon said, his voice tighter than in previous interviews. I handled files. That was all. You worked directly with Peter Lom, Carla said flatly. Multiple meetings, late hours, undocumented access. Fallon looked down but didn't respond. You were seen the night Ellen Monroe vanished, moving something. His lips pressed into a thin line. Carla leaned forward slightly, voice calm but firm. We have more than you think, Mr. Fallon. You're running out of time to tell your version before someone else does. For the first time, his composure wavered. His voice cracked slightly. I was just supposed to handle documents. That's all they told me. Who is they? He shook his head. I can't. You can. He wiped sweat from his forehead. If I talk, they'll come after me, even after all these years. Who? Fallon didn't answer. Instead, he whispered under his breath, You don't understand what kind of people you're dealing with. The interview was paused as Carla stepped out, frustrated, but certain of one thing. Fallon was involved, but he was also terrified. Whoever had orchestrated Ellen's disappearance had cast a long dark shadow over this town. Even after 15 years, that fear still lived inside the people who knew too much. And somewhere inside that fear was the truth. The interview room fell. Silent after Fallon's last words. He wouldn't say any more that day. The federal agents excused themselves while Carla and Sheriff Holbrook stood quietly outside the observation window. He's scared, Holbrook said, his voice low. Carla nodded. Which means whatever this is, it didn't end 15 years ago. For the first time since reopening the case, Carla realized they weren't just investigating a cold file. They were stepping into something still active, where someone, somewhere, still wanted the silence preserved. The next morning, Carla focused on what little Fallon had given them. They told me to handle documents. That was his phrase. She went back to the property dispute cases Ellen had been working on before she disappeared. The same names kept circling back, Caulfield, Whitaker, and the obscure corporate shells tied to both families. But as she dug further, something new appeared. In 1985, shortly before Ellen vanished, an unusual transaction had taken place involving a private trust fund. A small but valuable parcel of courthouse-adjacent land had been quietly transferred to a holding company listed under Milstone Preservation Partners, a company that hadn't existed before that year and dissolved shortly after Ellen's disappearance. The paperwork showed signatures, judge certification stamps, everything appeared legal. But Carla's stomach tightened as she noticed the judge's signature. It wasn't Ellen Monroe's handwriting. The signature was forged. She pulled Ellen's known signature from dozens of case files and compared it closely. No question. The approval on this property transfer had been falsified. Someone pushed this deal through after she disappeared, Carla whispered. Holbrook leaned in. And that piece of land? He asked. It sits right behind the courthouse, the same area where Ellen's belongings were hidden. That wasn't a coincidence. Carla requested access to the archived courthouse maintenance logs from that year. After hours of cross-referencing, she found a small entry dated 3 days after Ellen vanished. Minor wall stabilization, Eastbrook Facilities, Peter Lam's Shell Company. Carla exhaled. They weren't maintaining the wall, she said softly. They were sealing it. Holbrook stared at the record. They already knew she wasn't coming back. Now they had two undeniable links: a forged document with Ellen's stolen authority and a concealed construction entry days after her disappearance. Margaret was brought back into the conversation. As they carefully laid out the findings before her, she gripped the edge of the table. So it was about land, she said. Carla nodded gently. We believe Ellen stood in the way of someone finalizing an illegal transfer. She refused to authorize the paperwork, and instead of backing down, Margaret said softly, her voice breaking, they erased her. Holbrook finished. But who? Who gave that order? Margaret asked. That question still hung in the air. Carla suspected the families at the center of these land disputes, powerful names who'd operated behind closed doors for decades. But suspicion wasn't enough for formal charges. Not yet. We need more than just forgery and construction records, Holbrook said. We need someone to give up the entire chain. And there was still one man alive who could, Joseph Fallon. For 2 weeks, agents worked quietly behind the scenes, tracing Fallon's financial records. They discovered something odd: small, regular payments deposited into offshore accounts connected to an old trust. The payments started in late 1985 and continued in intervals for over a decade. The deposits were made by a company indirectly tied back to Caulfield family investments. They had been paying Fallon for years. Hush money. Now they have leverage. Fallon was brought back in under federal immunity negotiations. This time, he looked worn out, defeated. You don't understand, Fallon whispered. Back then, I was just trying to keep my job. They told me it was just paperwork, just cleaning up some filings. I didn't know how far it would go. You worked with Peter Lam? Carla asked. Fallon nodded. He handled the logistics. I handled the files. That's all I knew at first. And Ellen Monroe? Fallon's breathing grew uneven. She was stubborn. She wouldn't sign off. She caught discrepancies in the land filings. They tried to pressure her, but she refused. Carla leaned in. Who pressured her? Fallon hesitated. Lam came directly from the families. He never said which family member, but it was above him. He was the middleman. Carla didn't interrupt. The day she vanished, I wasn't supposed to be there late. Lam told me to meet him behind the service entrance. Said we needed to move something. I didn't ask questions. I saw him pull up in the back lot in a dark car. He had someone with him. I think she was unconscious. I don't know if she was alive. Fallon's voice cracked. I helped him move her inside the tunnel. Was she already dead? Carla asked gently. Fallon shook his head. I honestly don't know. He wiped tears from his eyes, his hands shaking. They said I'd be taken care of if I kept my mouth shut. And I was for years. Carla's chest tightened. She exchanged a glance with Holbrook. This was the closest thing they'd ever had to a confession, still not complete, still missing key names, but the picture was sharpening. The next morning, federal agents executed a subpoena for Peter Lam's financial records and last known contacts. Lam himself had not been seen for over a decade. but property ownership records revealed something useful. One of his shell companies still held partial ownership in real estate managed by a Caulfield family trust. The agents finally had grounds to press deeper. The families, for the first time, were now being officially drawn into the investigation. Margaret visited Ellen's memorial later that afternoon, standing quietly under the oak tree where they used to sit together. She placed a small white rose at the base of the marble plaque. The plaque read, "Judge Ellen Monroe. Loved, missed, never forgotten." Margaret whispered softly, "We're close, Ellie. I promise we're close." For 15 years, her sister's disappearance had been a silent wound. Now, for the first time, the silence was cracking. And behind that silence, Margaret could feel the weight of the truth slowly pushing its way to the surface. The walls around Milstone, once so carefully built to keep secrets hidden, were beginning to crumble. But every answer led to new shadows, new questions. Carla Simmons sat in her office, exhausted but focused, scanning years of financial and legal transactions tied to the Caulfield and Whitaker families. It wasn't just one land dispute. Over the years, millions of dollars had quietly shifted hands through shell companies, trusts, and private land transfers, many involving Courthouse real estate Ellen Monroe once oversaw. This wasn't some random crime of passion. This was organized, planned, controlled. And for the first time in 15 years, the names once whispered behind closed doors were now printed plainly in front of her. One stood out, Robert Whitaker, Sr., the patriarch of one of Milstone's wealthiest families. A man who had kept a low public profile, but maintained quiet control behind the scenes for decades. His name appeared on several trust agreements and property filings involved in the fraudulent land deals Ellen had pushed back against. Carla requested a formal interview. Robert Whitaker, now in his late 70s, agreed, with his attorney present. In a private conference room, Whitaker entered, slowly, assisted by a cane, his face calm, composed, and polite. "Of course, I'll answer whatever I can," he said, voice smooth. Carla didn't waste time. "We're re-examining your family's role in the Milstone Preservation Trust, particularly the 1985 Courthouse transfers." Whitaker smiled faintly. "That was handled through attorneys. My involvement was minimal." Carla studied him. "You're aware Judge Monroe refused to authorize certain filings before her disappearance?" Whitaker didn't blink. "I'm aware there were delays. Peter Lamb worked for a company hired by your trust to oversee renovations that year. I recall the name, yes." Carla leaned forward slightly. "Do you recall why your trust directly funded private work behind the courthouse wall days, after Judge Monroe disappeared?" Whitaker's attorney quickly interrupted. "My client is not required to speculate on matters outside confirmed records." Carla let the silence hang for a moment. "Mr. Whitaker, Judge Monroe's belongings were found hidden inside that wall. Surely you understand the seriousness of what we're discussing." Whitaker's eyes, for the first time, tightened ever so slightly. "I've always regretted what happened to Judge Monroe," he said softly. "It was a tragedy for the entire community." Carla stared at him. Not denial, not surprise, but distance, like a man carefully watching every word. When the interview ended, Carla left the room frustrated, but certain. Whitaker wasn't panicking. He wasn't angry. He was protecting someone. Later that week, the Federal Financial Task Force uncovered another critical lead. A previously undisclosed offshore account linked to Peter Lamb had received significant payments not long after Ellen's disappearance. The sender, a private investment company indirectly controlled by the Caulfield family. Both families, Whitaker and Caulfield, were now directly tied to the financial transactions that followed Ellen's disappearance. Carla sat with Holbrook that evening, piecing it together. "They didn't want Ellen dead simply because she refused to sign something," Carla said. "They needed her out of the way so they could forge signatures, complete the land transfers, and finalize deals without opposition. Holbrook nodded. It wasn't personal, it was business. And Peter Lamb was their fixer, Carla added. He handled the logistics. Fallon handled the paperwork. And when Ellen pushed back harder than they expected, they eliminated the problem. But even with the puzzle so close to completion, one massive gap remained. Proof of who gave the order. The turning point came unexpectedly. A former private accountant named Michael Dunn contacted federal agents after hearing about the reopened investigation. Dunn had quietly managed accounts for several wealthy families during the late 80s and 90s, including work connected to both the Caulfields and Whitakers. For years, he had stayed silent. I always knew something wasn't right, Dunn told agents during a confidential meeting. But back then, you didn't cross people like this. Under legal protection, Dunn shared records the families thought were destroyed. Hidden inside off-book ledgers were large, unreported cash payments paid out to Eastbrook facilities 6 months before and 6 months after Ellen's disappearance. These weren't maintenance payments, Dunn said. They were payouts. To whom, exactly, the ledgers didn't say, but the timing spoke volumes. The money moved before Ellen vanished, and more money moved after she was gone. Carla met Margaret that evening at the courthouse grounds. They sat beneath the large oak tree as dusk settled across Milstone. "We're closing in," Carla said quietly. "But we're still missing one final connection." Margaret stared ahead at the courthouse. "The people who did this, they walk free every day." Carla nodded slowly. "Not for much longer." As they sat together, neither spoke for several minutes. Margaret finally whispered, "Do you think she knew? Do you think she realized how dangerous this was?" Carla thought for a long moment. "I think she knew she was standing in the way of something big, but I don't think she ever believed they would go this far." Margaret's hands trembled slightly in her lap. "I never stopped hoping we'd find her," she said, "even when everyone else stopped looking." Carla placed a hand gently over hers. "We're not done yet." The following day, federal agents secured warrants for full financial disclosures from both families. Hidden trusts, real estate holdings, and shell accounts were brought into open review. The mountain of evidence was growing, and finally, a name appeared. Buried inside an obscure legal contract from 1985, the witness to the forged judge's signature was listed as P. Lam. There it was documented proof that Peter Lam had participated directly in falsifying Ellen's authorization for the land transfer. Now they had enough. Federal prosecutors prepared formal charges against multiple parties involved in the financial conspiracy. But Peter Lam himself remained missing, unaccounted, for after more than a decade. Still, the walls were closing in on everyone involved, and with each passing day, the space to hide was shrinking. But one truth still haunted Margaret most of all. What exactly happened to Ellen Monroe after that day on the courthouse steps? That answer, still buried for 15 long years, was now closer than ever. By the time the indictments were filed, Milstone wasn't whispering anymore. The town was buzzing, some openly talking, some quietly keeping their distance, but almost everyone knew the truth was pushing its way to the surface. Federal agents moved carefully. Official charges were filed for conspiracy, financial fraud, and obstruction of justice against several members of the Caulfield and Whitaker families. The shell companies were exposed. The illegal land deals were frozen. Civil suits were prepared. But even with everything coming to light financially, the core crime that started it all still lacked one thing: Ellen Monroe. No murder charge, no confirmed cause of death, and no body. Margaret sat across from Carla in the sheriff's office one afternoon, her voice tight but calm. "They've all confessed to money crimes," she said, "but not one of them has admitted what they did to Ellen." Carla nodded. "Because none of them want to be the first to admit to the part that can't be undone." Peter Lamb remained missing, leaving the largest unanswered question hanging in the center of everything. Without him, Holbrook said during one briefing, They may never break. A week later, Carla got a call. One of the younger federal investigators had located a lead in Georgia. An off-the-grid cabin rental property had recently been leased under an alias previously connected to Lam's financial history. A joint task force moved quietly and carefully. The cabin was small, isolated, nestled deep into the trees near a private lake. There was no vehicle on site. The man inside was arrested without incident. Peter Lamb. He looked older than his record. Suggested, thinner, with hollow cheeks, graying hair, and a slow, almost detached way of speaking. But his voice was calm. I wondered how long it would take, he said quietly. Lamb was transferred immediately back to Virginia. After several rounds of initial processing, Carla was granted clearance to interview him face to face. They sat across from each other in the small interrogation room. The tension in the room wasn't dramatic. It was cold, clinical. You've been running for a long time, Carla began. I wasn't running, Lam replied. I was waiting. For what? For this. He folded his hands gently in front of him, as though surrendering was part of a schedule he had long prepared for. Carla kept her voice steady. You know why we're here. Ellen Monroe. Lam nodded slowly. I know you were directly involved. Yes, then tell me. He leaned back slightly, as if unburdening himself after years of carrying something heavy. It wasn't supposed to happen that way, Lam began. Explain. She wasn't a problem until she made herself one, he said, his voice flat. At first, it was routine transfer filings, private land deals, quiet sign-offs. It was all clean on paper. And then, Carla pressed. Judge Monroe was more principled than anticipated. She caught irregularities we couldn't hide with legal language. She refused to approve transfers. Lam paused. They thought she could be pressured. They? Carla asked. You know who? Carla let the silence fill the space. The families wanted it handled discreetly, Lam continued. There were options discussed, incentives, warnings, but she still refused. Carla's stomach tightened. Then what? Lam exhaled slowly. They made a decision, and I was told to carry it out. He paused, eyes distant. That afternoon, I approached her as she left court. We talked briefly behind the courthouse. Was she forced? She was asked to reconsider her position, Lam said, choosing his words carefully. When she refused again, the decision was made to isolate her, just for a time. Carla's voice hardened slightly. Kidnap. Lam didn't respond to the word directly but continued. She was moved into the courthouse's back corridors, places not monitored, temporary holding. The plan was to convince her over time, but something changed, Carla said. Lam's face tightened. She resisted. She fought. He stared down at his hands. There was an accident. It wasn't part of the plan. Carla leaned in, her voice quiet but firm. What kind of accident? Lamb closed his eyes for a moment. There was a struggle. She struck her head. She lost consciousness. And then? She never woke. Up. For several seconds, the room was completely silent. Carla fought to keep her breathing steady. Why didn't you report it? They couldn't allow it, Lam said flatly. If the families were exposed, everything they built for decades would collapse. They ordered me to dispose of her quietly. The service tunnel allowed access. I sealed her personal items behind the wall to stage distance. The body was moved elsewhere. Where is she, Lam? Carla asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lam looked up at her for the first time, with a strange calm. That's the part I'm still not ready to share. The room froze. The partial confession answered so much, but not enough. They had the conspiracy, the cover-up, the handling of her personal effects, but not Ellen herself. Not yet. Lam's refusal sent the investigation into another round of search operations, now more targeted than ever. Search teams were deployed to multiple properties, once controlled by the Caulfield-Whitaker partnership. Old storage sites, rural estates, Even decommissioned buildings near the outskirts of Milstone were quietly examined one by one. Margaret, hearing the update, felt an old kind of ache return. They still won't say where she is. Carla placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We're close," she promised softly. "Closer than we've ever been." The morning was cold and gray as the search teams gathered at one of the last remaining undeveloped properties once controlled by the Whitaker family. It was an old storage estate miles outside Milstone, surrounded by aging oak trees and quiet back roads that hadn't seen traffic in years. The property had changed hands several times on paper, multiple shell companies, multiple trustees. Federal investigators had finally traced the chain back to the Caulfield-Whitaker partnership, directly tied to the same financial network that funded Eastbrook Facilities 15 years earlier. Carla Simmons stood quietly as forensic technicians began scanning the area with ground-penetrating radar. For weeks, this had been their only real shot at finding Ellen Monroe. Deputy Holbrook approached from behind. "This feels different," he said quietly. Carla nodded, her eyes locked on the technician's monitors. Within an hour, one of the teams signaled. The radar had picked up an irregular cavity several feet underground near what appeared to be an old maintenance shed on the far side of the property. They marked the ground carefully. By noon, digging began. The soil was dense but undisturbed, meaning whatever lay beneath had been there for a long time. 3 feet down, the first signs emerged. Fragments of deteriorated fabric, wooden splinters. A small piece of cracked leather, possibly from a shoe or handbag. Then, the unmistakable sight that every investigator in that field had feared, yet quietly expected. Skeletal remains, perfectly positioned, carefully placed. No shallow grave, no rushed disposal. This had been deliberate. As the scene was secured, forensic anthropologists worked meticulously to document and preserve every piece. Within hours, dental records would confirm what everyone already knew. It was Ellen Monroe. Margaret stood by the edge of the scene, clutching a handkerchief in her fist. Her face was pale, but she stood straight. Carla gently walked over to her. "I'm so sorry, Margaret," she whispered. Margaret nodded faintly, her voice breaking but steady. "At least she's not lost anymore." 15 years of not knowing had finally ended, not in the way she had hoped, but at least with truth. Back at federal headquarters, Peter Lamb was confronted with the discovery. He sat quietly for several moments before speaking. "That was always the plan," he finally said. "They wanted her far enough away that she'd never be found, but close enough that she was still under their control." Carla's voice remained calm. "Why didn't you tell us where she was?" Lamb looked almost detached. "Because as long as she wasn't found, I still had leverage. They were still paying me to stay quiet. Once she was discovered, the leverage disappeared." Carla stared at him, cold fury rising behind her eyes. "You buried a woman like she was an object." Lamb didn't respond. As the investigation closed in, the federal prosecutor finalized new charges, this time including murder, conspiracy to commit murder, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. Lamb faced the harshest charges as the direct facilitator. Joseph Fallon, already cooperating, would testify under protection. But most importantly, for the first time, several members of both the Caulfield and Whitaker families faced direct accountability, not just for fraud, but for knowingly ordering a chain of events that led to Ellen Monroe's death. And as the indictments went public, the town of Milstone was no longer silent. The truth was no longer buried. Weeks later, Margaret stood at Ellen's final burial, this time with full honors. The ceremony was small but deeply attended. Former colleagues, retired attorneys, some who had doubted, others who had whispered, now stood silently, ashamed of how long it had taken. Margaret placed a fresh white rose on Ellen's grave. Carla stood beside her, quietly respectful. "She stood her ground," Margaret whispered. Even when it cost her everything, Carla nodded softly. And because she did, none of this stayed hidden forever. Later that evening, Margaret sat alone in her living room, looking through Ellen's old photo album. So many memories. So many years stolen, but finally, closure. A knock on the door startled her gently. She opened it to find Carla holding a small evidence bag. Inside was Ellen's restored gold watch, the one found frozen at 4:27 p.m. behind the courthouse wall. "We had it cleaned," Carla said quietly. "I thought you should have it." Margaret's hands trembled as she took it, her eyes wet. "Thank you." For the first time in 15 years, the watch ticked softly, once again restored, running, whole. And in that small sound was a strange kind of peace. The nightmare was over. 6 months later, the courtroom in Milstone was quiet. Again, but this time, for the right reasons. The trials were over. Peter Lamb was sentenced to life without parole. Joseph Fallon, after full cooperation, received a reduced sentence. Multiple members of both the Caulfield and Whitaker families faced prison time, financial collapse, and public disgrace. The decades-long power structure that once ruled Milstone silently had finally fallen apart. But for Margaret, the trials weren't the ending. They were simply a door closing. The real ending was far more personal. On a calm spring afternoon, she visited Ellen's grave once more. The headstone now read, "Judge Ellen Monroe, 1947 to 1985. A life of truth, a sacrifice not forgotten." Margaret placed the gold watch on the grave, softly ticking. No longer stuck at 4:27 p.m., standing under the same oak tree where they once shared lunches. She whispered, "You never compromised." And because of that, they couldn't bury you forever. She stood quietly for a while, feeling the warm breeze. And for the first time in 15 years, the weight she had carried all these years began to lift. The truth had taken everything, but at last it had given something back. Peace.